astonished by this? Or maybe a better question would be, at what point over the past 20, 30 years, though you're a young man, so I shouldn't stretch it off that far, but at what point were you going to be less surprised by these figures? When did you feel we were making that shift in our national paradigm?
I think first it was in the mid-'80s when we began to see evidence that inequality had started to rise. It actually started to rise in the very late '70s, but it wasn't until the mid-'80s that it began to get on the sort of statistician's radar screen, and you could see enough data to see it actually change. And what was threatening about it, as we talked about it before, not that it was so fast, it was there was a big bump, relatively big bump. Let me back up. Some economists have talked about watching inequality like it was like watching the grass grow. It didn't change at all, only very, very gradually after World War II. It started gradually to go down, and it went down from 45 through mid-'70s, just a little bit each year. This was really a very encouraging secular trend, because to the extent that we have a social policy in this country, it's been to grow the middle class. And this was the period in which, indeed, we grew the middle class, in part through a booming economy, but also because we supported some of the important institutions like public higher education, which let people move into skilled positions in the middle class. After the '70s, after stagflation, after the kinds of retrenchments that occurred in American industry in order to cut costs and become more internationally competitive, high school educated workers, particularly male high school educated workers, took an enormous hit in their income. Between the late '70s and the mid-'90s, they lost 17% of their income in real terms after inflation. That's an enormous, enormous change for the 40-odd% of the population that has no college whatsoever at all.
And yet I had the feeling in looking through, and I must say I was looking through these last 3 volumes that the Russell Sage Foundation has underwritten, that there was somewhere your authors were sort of saying there are ways, maybe not ways that will ultimately be successful, but there are ways of sort of working the system. Am I wrong in that? For instance, the advice, don't stay in one place.
Right.
Are there ways, or are they just such minor methods that our madness can't really be dealt with?
We looked, and this is I think what you're referring to, at very low wage jobs. Mm-hmm. These were people making less than $12,500 a year for 3 years in a row. And this is the Moving Up or Moving Out book that you
Right.
mentioned at the beginning. And Harry Holzer, who was the lead economist in this team, wanted to find out how much mobility there is for those people if they keep working. And what he found was, it's sort of a glass half full, glass half empty. What he found was that about half are able to move up from that very low position over a 6-year period. The other half, around 45%, are stuck. They're stuck still they're still in the labor force, they're still working, but they're working at $12,000 a year, which is, well, I need to tell you, an extremely small amount of money in this economy. Now, we wanted to find out, is there hope really for people at the bottom? If that number had been, I don't know, an escape out of low-wage jobs more like 75%, then I think I could have answered your question and said, yes, low-wage jobs are a stepping stone, not a dead end. But I have to tell you that I think they're at least as much a dead end as they are a stepping stone. And those people who get out turn out to be people who move early and move into a good company. That was the really story of that study. There are certain companies which for various internal reasons are concentrating on a high training, high productivity path to competition as opposed to cutting labor costs. And those companies are very, very good places to be, and even for a worker with limited education, if they get in a good niche in those companies, they can experience significant income increase. I'll tell you another story just quickly. You mentioned Catherine Newman's forthcoming book. That's the second book in a series. The first book looked at McDonald's workers about the mid-90s. And now she's gone back to that same group of McDonald's workers 10 years later and asked, where are they? What happened to them? And what you find is that 10%, these are McDonald's workers in Harlem, around 125th Street. I'm probably not supposed to say they're McDonald's. She calls them Burger Barn. They're in a franchised.
I recognize.
Yes, okay.
Not that well hidden.
All right. At any rate, the question is, how do they do in 10 years? 10% of them, roughly, have done extremely well. They've moved up from $6.50 an hour, which they were making, to making more than $11 an hour, which is, if we multiply that by 2,000, that's getting on towards $25,000 a year. If you put two of those salaries together from two young people, that's a viable start for a family, even in New York City. On the other hand, fully 40% of all her workers were doing less well 10 years later than they had been in the mid-90s.
I found it hard to puzzle that out, to do less well.
Yeah.
What does that mean about them or about the employers?
It probably means that they were young when she first observed them, and that for one reason or another they went downhill. They were striving. They maybe were trying to combine some education with their work at McDonald's, but it may not have worked. They may not have gotten their GED, their high school equivalency degree. Right. They may have encountered greater family responsibilities. A lot of these young people do. For one reason or another, they began to detach from the labor force, and they probably were employed many fewer hours when she saw them the second time.
Have we as yet seen the impact of what has been happening here upon kids going into higher education, being able to go to college and stay there?
Yeah, we have. Maybe you know these numbers. It runs something like this. If you look at the children of families who are earning in the top fifth of the income distribution, about 52% of them have finished their degree within a reasonable period of time. I should back up, okay? This is a study that started in 1988, and it took 8th graders in 1988, and it asked 10 years later, did they get a degree or not? 52% of those 8th graders in 1988 had completed a degree 10 years later if you come from a wealthy family. If you come from a family in the poorest fifth, the number is 6%.
6.
Yeah. So there's just an enormous difference. And that, you asked before about political influence and whether that difference is growing, and I was coy about that because we don't yet know. But I can tell you that the higher education difference is growing. So that if you look roughly from the early 80s to the early 90s, which is where we have data, what you see is that everybody, that is, kids from all of the income groups, went to college somewhat more frequently than they had in the past, as everybody began to realize the increasing economic importance of a college education. But the increase was biggest at the top and progressively smaller as you go down the income scale.
So the gap increases.
Yes.
We have very little time left. I want to ask you, how many Americans do you think, what percentage of Americans really understand this, that the gap is increasing?
Now, that's interesting. I'm trying to think if I can give you a precise number. Again, there's a political scientist, Lawrence Bartels at Princeton, who has measured these exactly that kind of question. And what he finds, as I remember, is that there's a good percentage of people, let's say on the order of 60%, I may not have that number exactly right, who do understand that inequality has been going up and who do think it's bad for the country. But those same people supported at very high rates the repeal, for example, of the estate tax. They supported Bush's 2 tax cuts. So for some reason, they don't understand, they seem not to understand the political implications of these policies, even though the tax cuts may give them a small initial increase in their spendable income because their taxes will go down. They don't seem to see that those very same tax increases will impose cuts on programs, which are starting to happen now, which will impact them much more severely than the little bit of tax savings that they achieve.
So this is what's the matter with Kansas.
Yes, it's very close to what's the matter with Kansas. Tom Frank's argument, I think, is that not only do they not recognize their economic self-interest, but they seem to be much more preoccupied with, what should we call it, their social self-interest, their belief that the culture is going to hell in a handbasket, and that the importance of opposing abortion, opposing gay marriage, restoring creationism in the schools, and so forth, is somehow symbolically more important to them than these economic issues. And he blames the Democratic Party largely for abandoning its economic populism, which once was so strong in Kansas.
In your studies, in your various studies, do you find that people in the low-wage group deal at all with these social issues?
Most of the people we talk to directly are not too concerned with these social issues. They're concerned with survival day to day, getting ahead, taking care of their family, and so forth. I do think, however, that, and I should emphasize, I have no proof of this, it's my own hunch, that to some extent the fact that we have so much economic insecurity in this country accounts for some of the turn towards social issues and towards fundamentalist religion, which provides a kind of symbolic reassurance and comfort in ways this economy does not.
You mean the next life, in a sense?
Yes, in a sense. And this life, too, because churches provide a kind of instant community. We have an incredibly mobile economy where people are moving much more, for example, than in Europe. We make many more long-distance moves. A family arrives in a new place, they don't know anybody, a church is a source of support. Because we have so many fewer other civic groups than we used to 50 years ago, the church is what's left. And in this case, it's been various variants of evangelical enthusiastic religion that have been most vibrant and have filled this need.
We have about a minute. Okay. Let me ask you, with all of this, how the global economy, in your estimation, impacts upon the problem as you've described it.
It impacts at many different places. Obviously, capital is now much more mobile than it used to be. You can move production around the world. You can split up the value-added chain and put pieces of it here and pieces of it there, and because of information technology, you can coordinate all that. You can outsource and subcontract and offshore, and you can also import workers, low-cost workers, and we, of course, have a steady flow of willing immigrant workers, which does, of course, put downward pressure on the wages of workers with modest education. So for all those reasons, globalization, I think, and I think everyone agrees to this, has had quite a negative impact on the outcomes for low education workers in this country.
Would you oppose it? 15 seconds.
Would I oppose what?
Globalization, for that.
I don't think you can. It's like King Canute, you can't hold back the tides. I think what we have to do is figure out a way to rearrange, reform our institutions to preserve the lifestyle and life quality of those people who are most threatened by globalization.
Dr. Eric Wanner, obviously we have much, much more to talk about, and you will come back when you have that study in hand.
All right, I promise.
Thanks. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, too.
And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck.